First up, we will have Jeremy Pittman, who's an assistant professor with the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. Just give a little wave there. Then after Jeremy, we'll have Gabrielle Bastien, who's both founder and executive director of Regeneration Canada. Hi, Gabrielle. Then we'll hear from Kathleen Kevany, associate professor of food systems at Dalhousie University. And we'll close up with Éric Darier, ecological campaigner for Greenpeace. And my name is Ryan Katzrazine, and I'm an assistant professor here at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. So, without further ado, I think I will turn it over to Jeremy to begin. Awesome. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. As Ryan was saying, I'm Jeremy Pittman. I'm an assistant professor, School of Planning, University of Waterloo. Just started about a year ago. Yeah, maybe before I begin, I'd just like to thank Ryan and Shannon for organizing this. It's been excellent. One thing I really like is it's not an echo chamber. There's really diverse opinions in the room, and it's been really nice to kind of hear these and discuss these over the last couple days. So I study a broad range of things. I have a broad range of interests. I do some work in sort of the marine ocean space, looking at sort of coastal systems, coastal marine systems, small-scale fisheries and whatnot in the Caribbean, South America. So that's one part of my work, but what I'm going to speak to you today a little bit more is sort of focused on how do we do agriculture and biodiversity together on landscapes. For this work, I draw on a lot of examples and experience in Saskatchewan. I grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan, and it's just a place where I really like to think about some of these issues. There's a lot of how we're going to do this, a lot of how we're going to transition between different proteins, that type of thing will happen in these landscapes. So I'll kind of use Saskatchewan as a touchstone throughout my work to sort of ground some of these ideas. So Ryan asked us to talk about how can we mitigate the environmental impacts of protein production, as well as how might environmental change, climate change kind of shape the production of proteins. And so yeah, I've been reflecting about that over the last couple of days a lot, and thinking about some of the discussion here as well. One thing that I've really been reflecting on is how did we do this when I was growing up? Because we were just kind of flipping between proteins and all that kind of stuff. I was really kind of curious, thinking about how do we get to lentils eventually. How did that transition happen? So, in the 80s, I grew up on a wheat farm, mostly wheat, a little bit of oil seeds. We used to actually grow canary seed a little bit for people keeping canaries in New York City and stuff. And it was a bit of a cash crop for us, but also it provided something to work into the rotation. If you grow wheat every year, it's not good. So we worked sort of oil seeds into the rotation, a little bit of a cash crop. That type of thing to kind of keep the farm businesses operating. One thing that was a little bit different for us compared to our peers and our neighbors was we actually raised hogs as well. We had a really small-scale hog operation. Duroc and Yorkshire kind of running around our farm, really small scale, but it provided sort of, again, like an extra source of income for us. The 80s on the prairies were super dry. The wheat crops weren't doing so well. The farmland agriculture wasn't doing so well. It was sort of this period where, having actually using some of these at the time for our area, kind of an alternative protein at that time. I know it's pork, it's very mainstream, but in terms of the production in our area, was actually one way that we were able to kind of get through some of these things. Early 90s rolled around, a bunch of different forces. On the hog side, there was kind of a bigger flip in the industry towards more industrialized operations, kind of coming in at the same time with changes in regulations, that type of thing. We were kind of pushed out of the hog business, essentially. It wasn't viable anymore. That was kind of concurrent with kind of broadly in the industry. Coming through the 80s, the family farms weren't doing so well. It was really dry, as I mentioned before. But you had these other economic factors that were sort of increasing our vulnerability to these things. Land prices were really high, as well as interest rates were really high. So coming through that, there's a lot of economic pressure on the family farm operations. The way that the system responded, and we've heard a lot the last couple of days around sort of the role of extension, and back then we actually had a lot more extension. There's a lot more going on. And one thing that they really pushed a lot was diversification, which is, it's been pushed forever, but it was one thing that they really pushed a lot back then. And as a kid kind of going through this, I remember it almost seemed like the sky was the limit in terms of what you could diversify to. So, we used to go to these farm progress shows, and there'd be like emu and ostrich there and elk and all these different, like these really, to us, like really strange types of animals that they're trying to get us to grow. The way that those types of systems kind of went, if you got in at the ground floor and you were able to sell the breeding stock, you maybe did okay. But the people that were actually trying to do it as more of a livelihood actually went broke. There was no markets for these things. Nobody wants to eat ostrich really, and it was just kind of almost doomed to fail. But it was one thing that was happening in the industry at the time. Coming out of that though, there were a few options that stuck, and one of those options was lentils. It was something, as a wheat farmer, we could grow lentils without new equipment. We had to learn how to use that equipment a little bit differently. When we started growing lentils, we plugged the combines a lot, all those kind of things. It was a bit of a challenge, but at least within sort of the way that our system worked, we could switch to lentils fairly easily. There was a good, strong market in India and other parts of the world that would buy these lentils from us. So economically and sort of logistically on the operations, it made sense. And they kind of saved a lot of family farms, to be honest. I don't know if our family farm would be around if it wasn't for lentils. We sort of switched to lentils pretty hard. And again, it was something that we could work into our rotation. So you typically, where we were doing a lot of like cereals, oilseeds before, you work in a pulse into that rotation, and it sort of potentially helps build your soils, that types of thing. It's probably a baby step maybe towards regenerative agriculture in this context, a small step, but kind of thinking about just why that happened and where some of the roots of that came from. Some of the work I'm doing now, so since we've seen this onslaught of lentils on the prairies. One thing, kind of thinking about the biodiversity element a little bit more. So, if you drive around rural Saskatchewan now, you'll start to notice. You'll see like in the lentil fields, there's a lot more pronghorn antelope, kind of locating there. It seems like lentils are influencing these landscapes in ways that maybe support a little bit biodiversity in this context. I've been doing some interviews with some people in our area that kind of know what it was like before. As settlers, we started breaking the prairie and thinking about what sort of animals were there before. And a lot of them were saying that, as a lot of the settlers were coming, the animals you saw there were a lot of moose and pronghorn. That's sort of the mix of what you saw there. As more and more prairie got broke, that kind of switched to being white-tailed deer and mule deer. I didn't see moose a lot growing up. There was like hardly any there. But in sort of the mid-90s, moose started coming back. Pronghorn were always kind of around, but they used to kind of hang out more in the hills where there's bigger patches of grass. But now, with sort of lentils across these landscapes, you're seeing a lot more pronghorn that are sort of like selecting it, we think, for food. Lentils are really good food for humans, but they also are potentially a really good food source for a lot of different animals. So we think that's why that's happening. To be honest though, we're not totally sure. That's one thing. I'm actually working on a project right now with Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment where we're trying to actually test some of these hypotheses about the role of lentils in these ecosystems as a food source. But kind of anecdotally, it is something that seems like there might be something there. Kind of shifting up a little bit though. So when you think about biodiversity and agricultural production in this landscape, this transition to lentils is still part of a bigger, this really huge land use change that's happening for the last 150 years, where we've really broken a lot of prairie and really transformed this ecosystem to something very different. These landscapes are completely different to what they were when settlers first stepped out there. And so, when you're thinking about how you might move this forward, like one thing that lentils will never replace is native grass in terms of their role for biodiversity and that type of thing. And I mentioned that lentils are good for, potentially some of these species that aren't necessarily at risk, things like pronghorn and moose and that type of thing. But when you start thinking about species at risk, you need to start thinking about native grassland ecosystems and how you can restore them. And that kind of shifts, into the realm, into a completely different production system, which is the ranching out there. a lot of the remaining species at risk habitat is actually found on ranches. That's not because the ranching is necessarily having an impact. It can if it's done improperly, but part of it is because those are the kind of the last areas where a lot of these species at risk can actually survive. So it's a bit, I know cows have been kind of beat up a little bit over the last couple days, but in this sort of landscape, they can play a potentially important role in conserving biodiversity. And thinking about the future, I think there's some really, we need to start rethinking how these landscapes are configured. Right now, it's kind of, as I mentioned, there's like grass over there, crops over here. That's not necessarily the best for biodiversity. It's more about how do you start to maybe make fields a bit smaller or something like that. How do you start adding in prairie strips so that this kind of the separation between the native grass and your cropland agriculture isn't so abrupt and distinct. There's some work I was chatting with a few people here actually. There's some work coming out of Carleton by Lenore Flaurig that suggests that from a connectivity and ecosystem standpoint, those types of landscapes can actually be really beneficial. Even though they're fragmented, they can still be somewhat healthy. So thinking about how that might work in this landscape will be important, and part of that, for at least the short term, really involves thinking about how we can raise cattle on these landscapes. It's something that, time is up, so I'll finish up here quickly, but it's something that can play a really important role. You could do the same thing with bison. People have tried. Again, it comes down to markets a little bit, and there's not always a market for bison meat, that type of thing, but just thinking about a ruminant on these landscapes, in addition to lentils, in addition to cereals, I think will be important for the future, for biodiversity in particular. Anyways, thank you.
Next up, we'll have Gabrielle Bastien.
Is the clicker? I just go this way? My points. Perfect. I'll wait a tiny bit because the PowerPoint is important for what I'll say. Great. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for the invitation, and thanks everybody for your contributions so far. It's really been a pleasure hearing a variety of perspectives on the topic. So I'd like to start by actually reframing the question that was asked of us on this panel, because I think we urgently need to move away from trying to reduce our detrimental impact, move away from doing less harm. So instead of asking how we can reduce our detrimental impacts on the environment from protein production, I'm interested in thinking about how we can actually use protein production to improve the health of our lands and to have a net positive impact on our environment. So in trying to answer that question, I will focus on soil, because soil health is the basis of environmental health. So we're on the Climate Change and Biodiversity panel, and so soils play a really important role in regulating our climate through soil carbon sequestration. They purify our air, and healthy soils support a biodiverse ecosystem as well. On top of that, a healthy soil provides countless ecosystem services that we take for granted every day, like filtering our water, holding water to regulate floods and droughts as well. But for far too long, we've only looked at what was above ground, and we've isolated it from the rest of the system and designed our agricultural systems in relation to what we thought the plant needed. So we killed everything around it, tilled the ground before planting, and fed it with concentrated amounts of fertilizers. Well, in doing that, we forgot that our agricultural systems are actually ecosystems with multiple different parts, many different beneficial interconnections between these parts. And it's not only the above-ground ecosystem that's important. In fact, it's the basis of that ecosystem is the below-ground biodiversity that's in the soil, so the bacteria, the protozoa, the nematodes, the fungi. When they're happy, that's when the whole rest of the ecosystem can thrive. So we should have thought about how to feed them instead of how to feed the plants. So that was paradigm shift number one. Now, paradigm shift number two. Although many of you probably know about this, but for those who don't, Soils are also the largest terrestrial carbon sink, so they hold 2 to 3 times as much carbon than the atmosphere. And unfortunately, in large part due to industrial agricultural practices, but also deforestation and other human impacts, we've degraded a lot of our soils worldwide, and that's caused the loss of soil carbon to the atmosphere. So a study actually came out last year saying that since the beginnings of agriculture, we've lost 133 billion tons of soil carbon, which have largely been emitted to the atmosphere and contributed to climate change. Now, the current CO2 levels in the atmosphere are 407 ppm, and what we need to try to do is to get back to the only levels that we know are safe, so pre-industrial levels of 260 ppm. So that means that we need to sequester about 300 billion tons of carbon. And I've included a photo of photosynthesis here to remind us all that still to this day, plants are the best known, cheapest way to sequester carbon, since they take CO2 from the atmosphere, turn it into glucose, and put it in their biomass, or they actually channel a lot of those carbon compounds into the ground to feed the soil microbiome. So this is what regenerative agriculture seeks to do. Regenerative agriculture promotes practices that seek to regenerate soil health and build soil carbon. It also has a strong ethics and welfare focus, but I want to mention now that not all organic farming is actually regenerative. A lot of organic agriculture is done with intensive tilling, which is counter-regenerative practices. So a few examples here of regenerative practices, and a lot of them relate to protein production in different ways. I won't go in depth for all of them, but in a nutshell, what we're trying to do here is to enable the conditions in which the soil microorganisms thrive. So step number 1 is not turning their habitat upside down, so not tilling. Soil cover is also very important. We can think of soil cover as a protective layer, such as our skin. So it keeps the humid and lower temperature conditions that soil microorganisms like. Prioritizing perennials is also very beneficial for soils. Perennials stay in the ground year after year. They grow deeper roots, and that's beneficial. In a similar way, agroforestry, so integrating tree crops in agricultural systems, is very good, again, for those deeper roots. And on that note, actually, growing nut trees, integrating nut trees in agricultural systems is a really good way to supply for protein needs. Enhancing the soil biologically through compost and compost tea is very beneficial too. So compost is not only carbon, but it's nutrients, and it's actually life that you're putting in the soil. And last but not least, integrating livestock in strategic ways in our agricultural systems really helps soil microorganisms thrive and is beneficial for soil carbon sequestration. And because this event is focused on protein production, and since I consider this being the largest opportunity we have to turn a degenerative industry into a highly beneficial one that can improve the health of our landscapes and sequester carbon, I'll focus the rest of the talk on regenerative grazing of ruminants through a method called holistic management. So holistic management was developed by someone named Alan Savory, who's an ecologist from Zimbabwe. So the whole concept of holistic management, well, first of all, I need to say it's an elaborate planning process that determines how to move cattle on land in order to optimize the recovery time of grasses, optimize soil regeneration, and according to that land's specific conditions, the climatic conditions, as well as the landowner's specific goals. It's an adaptive methodology, so it's an elaborate planning process that acknowledges that the plan will change along the way according to the specific conditions of that season. And the whole concept is about mimicking nature. So back when we had large herds of ruminants roaming on lands and that were staying in a concentrated manner and constantly moving because of predator pressure. So now that we no longer have those large herds of ruminants or the predator pressure, well, we need to do with what we have, and we have large herds of cattle that we can manage according to what we know now. So this is to illustrate how deep topsoil can go in grasslands ecosystems due to very deep root systems of grasses. So topsoils can go as deep as 10 to 12 feet, and that whole layer sequesters high amounts of carbon. And we need ruminants because ruminants can digest cellulose in grasses. So in order for grasslands to be as productive as can be, they actually need the help of ruminants. Just quickly here, for you to know a few synonyms-ish, because there are nuances here. But when people talk about holistic planned grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and mob grazing, they're highly similar methods. What is not the same as holistic management is simply rotational grazing. That does not mean the same. Obviously, continuous grazing, so just leaving cattle on pasture, does not yield the same results at all and can lead to overgrazing. I'm mentioning this here because there has been some science done about holistic management specifically, but there's also been some reviews that include other methodologies that are very different from holistic management. So it's important to keep that in mind when we analyze the science that's out there. So this is to illustrate also that we can actually regenerate land that was previously barren through this method. So when we're thinking about land use for the future and thinking about the fact that there's currently 1/3 of our land that's degraded, well, we can make the most of that land by doing what has been done at the left of the fence, holistic management, and actually improve ecosystem services, improve water holding capacity, grow vegetation on that land, and yield some meat from the livestock as well. So this photo was taken in South Africa. Thank you, Seth, for the photo. Very quickly here, I don't know how long I have left. 1 minute. 1 minute? So perhaps we can talk more about methane in the discussion part. But this is just to say that obviously methane is a huge issue in concentrated animal feeding operation. The way that livestock is raised currently, probably in 99% of America, is a huge issue for methane. However, I went to a talk by soil scientist Christine Jones a few years ago, who was saying that when cattle are on pasture, there's actually bacteria in the soil that feed on methane, methanotrophic bacteria. And when there's a lot of methane, well, they reproduce and actually degrade a large part of that methane. So she was claiming that methane should not be an issue when cattle are on pasture, and she was supporting this fact by this ice core data. Here on this graph, the methane is the green line, and we can see the line going very high up in recent years. And historically, methane levels were much, much lower, although there was a much higher number of total ruminants on the planet with bison, antelopes. So I'm not an expert on the topic, but this does seem to support the fact that it should not be an issue on pasture. And just to say also, so some of the best results in the science to this day about soil carbon sequestration with these methods have been by scientist Richard Teague as well as Mac Muller. Some of them have gotten up to 3 tons of carbon per acre per year of sequestration by these methods. So it's a really big opportunity to improve the health of our lands. So just quickly, because I know my time's up, I didn't talk very much about Regeneration Canada and what we do. So a large part of our mission is to help raise awareness and gain public engagement for how important soil regeneration is. So we're trying to educate the general public about this. If you're interested in learning more, I would urge you to go to our website. It's a good tool to try to speak about this to people who don't know about this topic at all. We're also trying to build a network gathering everybody around this topic, so you can learn more about it on our website as well. And we'll have our next Living Soil Symposium Montreal from March 28th to 31st at Marché Montsecours in the Old Port. So feel free to keep in touch, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Next up we have Kathleen.
Do like others and get my timing here. Oh, yeah. So Good morning. Today I'm going to invite you to think with me about climate change being the social justice, health, and environmental issue of our time. And if the answer was easy, we'd be there. We wouldn't even need to be in this room. We'd be done. We'd be doing other things. It's gorgeous out today. But today we have climate change pressing upon us, and it's a critical state. We have got to take action. So when I do work with my students or talks about the necessity to examine our food systems, I love this piece that comes from the food FAO and other colleagues who've been working on this. This is 2012. You could examine all of it, and thank you for the good work, Ryan, of bringing together such a disparate collection of voices and ideas and passions, because we really need systems thinking to get at this. So today I'm just going to talk about the petal that's looking at environment, of course, but all of them need to be factored into our equation. It does no good, friends, to leave a dragon out of your calculations if you live near one. And I dare say we do. Friends who have done research in this field know that the report from 2006 and many other reports since Livestock's Long Shadow, I would challenge some of our findings, and our friends in the field who are doing much more of this would remind us that we have got to mitigate and not just address in a gentle way, but reverse. And I applaud the effort to be regenerative, and we have the opportunity to do that. So just this week, or last week, we had our colleague Bruce Lister remind us that we're seeing great biodiversity loss in Puerto Rico. You may have heard that. He had 40 years vantage point. 40 years ago, he was there. Now it's decimated, the populations that he studied. It's shocking. And we heard it yesterday, biodiversity loss, how critical this is. I think Jody made mention yesterday of the IPC report just last week as well. We have got to change things around. And fortunately, we can, because we have all of you brilliant people who can do things differently together. But we have to examine the reality. We have got to look at the dragon. And I'm just going to look at some of the elements of agriculture as we've designed it. It need not be the way it is in large scale. We can change it around the world. So we have, by 2025, we're going to have people stressed, needing water, and yet it's mismanaged and misused around the world, and the footprint is unconscionable. Water wars are coming should we not be more prudent, and this is an issue of social justice as well. Of course, we need land for grazing. We need to do some of the regenerative practices that colleagues are talking about, but you can't ignore the figures. We can't ignore the consequences of this footprint. And of course, we're talking about protein, so where are our opportunities? Lucky for all of us, plants are full of proteins. And all of the foods, we can create innovative ways to use a diversity of foods much more logically and strategically. Sadly, deforestation is a critical element of our systems, and the figures are telling. We take down forests at levels that you can't even imagine that it would be sensible to do, and yet we continue to do so. We are clearing more land that's being used for not just grazing, but for feed, which of course is inefficient. And the conversion rate, again, makes us question whether that's a legitimate or moral use of resources on the planet. Not to mention the beauty of the greenhouse gas sequestering and the opportunities to use the field and the trees, but also the other life in those. What else do we lose when we have deforestation? That's a call out to you. Biodiversity, that's it. We are losing a lot of life when we practice these methods. I don't need to educate this audience, but others might not know that confinement could be the other C in CAFOs, but concentrated feedlots are creating conditions that we didn't hear a lot about it yesterday in the health panel, but certainly zoonotic diseases are growing around the world, and again, these issues are global. We have an issue of social justice that people who have less opportunity have greater exposure to zoonotic diseases, and it's now one of the number 10 causes of death for people who have less favorable conditions. We also didn't hear about antibiotic resistance that is contributing and growing in these kind of conditions. And then there's the other pretty picture. Anybody want to live near here? Anybody live near one of these? Humans are pretty heroic, but we do not create excrement to this level. And these tailing ponds in these conditions are creating tremendous eutrophication around delicate, essential bodies of water. And it's not, again, the privileged people who see this or smell it or have to even taste it. We see racism in our food system, and people who are less advantaged and less vocal are subject to live near these. We must not fail to understand that element either. So we heard a bit about the greenhouse gas emissions. We have wonderful research. Of course, there's more than we have time to cover, but the three critical ones we're talking about, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. We could argue about the figures. This is IPC from 2007. We have many more up to date. The same kind of outcome, whether we argue whether it's transportation or animal agriculture. I think we can agree climate change is happening. It's driven by human effort, and it's largely animal agriculture. We can also get at some of the other lifestyle things that were made mention of yesterday, like not flying, those things. Certainly, we should be doing all that we can to mitigate harm and to turn this around. But fortunately, we can. In examining some of the research that was happening during a time when industry was very effective in overstating its positive benefit to the marketplace and understating the science, Judge Source and Sorkin came to the conclusion that all too often in the choice between the physical health of consumers and financial well-being of business, concealment is chosen over disclosure, sales over safety, and money over morality. You might recognize this back in the date of this is not even that far out. This is related to tobacco. 7,000 articles it took before the Surgeon General made a public association between lung cancer and the use of tobacco. We have got to also, I appreciate, and we didn't hear a lot of it yesterday, but I would challenge a lot of what our colleagues said about health implications from animal. We have a lot of findings that show opportunities for other better outcomes through other methods, which I'll get to. So we have the opportunity to extend our discourse together. What kind of society do we want to create? I love that the ethics asked us that. And that Andrew says, I don't want to live in a world where we aren't moral together, that we're not asking each other those deep and important questions. And we have to examine our previously unpenetrable questions. So for every action, there is an equal and opposite government program. I love this picture because it reminds us that I like to say agricultural policy is health policy, it is environmental policy, it is social policy, it is economic policy. The question is it good policy? What do you think? How are we doing? I don't think we're stacking up very good. Our agricultural policy is creating tremendous adverse impacts. And here in Canada, I think many folks had mentioned it yesterday. I think Paul was talking about the fact that we're coming out with our food policy in Canada, the first time ever. One, do we care? And two, who's going to notice, and is it going to change? And hopefully, it's going to inform our practice, but it needs coherence. Sadly, at the same time, we have the Minister of Agriculture emphasizing the export of high-value items like beef and lobster and other things that have all these other consequences that are understated when we look through an economic lens alone. So to my dear friend says, think about it. If we can live well without causing unnecessary harm, but better than that, raising the standard together, why wouldn't we? So you might know the name James Cameron. He knows a few things about what's going on in the world. He's invested in the biggest pea protein facility in organic pea protein in Saskatchewan. France has invested in Manitoba. He's also coming out with a film talking about the strength of people who are plant-based athletes. Not only do you perform better, you recuperate well. And there's that thing like, you don't need much Viagra, just saying. So, we have challenges before us. We have to feed more people. We have to address climate change. We can't not do both those things. We also have to prevent harm and regenerate prospects and be innovative together. And as Hugo said yesterday, we have to create greater stability, security, and increase our respect for our interconnectedness. So, who's heard of this? Project Drawdown. Yay. More of you, please take time to go to this website. Paul Hawking from Natural Capitalism. Lots of ideas. These are the best scientists in the world who have come up with strategies that are proving already not only to mitigate, reverse climate change. And the top 10 for their value for climate change reversal. Here they are. Refrigeration, modification. We already have the Montreal Protocol. That can be enhanced. Wind turbines on land. Number 3 and number 4, food. Reduce food waste. Number 4, plant-based. We got to do it. And the beauty is it can turn the ship around. So I invite you to join with me in the journey of this wonderful group that we are developing across the world, particularly a group in North America at the moment, who are plant-rich living, because we're interested in far more than diet. It's about all these lifestyle choices. So thank you very much. Look forward to you joining with me.
My name is Éric Darier. I work for Greenpeace. I work for Greenpeace International. I used to work for Greenpeace in Canada years ago. So my comments come from that perspective. Now, the beauty of coming at the end of a conference and at the end of a panel, you have at least the advantage of what people have said before. So I had a talk, but I think there's a consensus around the need to act because of climate change, because of biodiversity. So I'm not going to actually repeat it. What I'm going to do instead is actually keep the PowerPoint presentation that was originally planned, and I will make some general comments. So it's going to be a bit schizophrenic, but if you don't like what I'm saying, you can look at the pretty pictures, and I think you'll be fine. Just a bit of context first, maybe 1 minute on the context. Greenpeace published a report earlier this year, which basically summarizes or looks at 3 sets of recent scientific data on both climate change, on biodiversity, and on health issues. And all the evidence shows that we have to act. Right? I think there's been a consensus here. We are demanding a reduction of meat consumptions and dairy by 50% based on the current consumption level, right? So that means if you think of projections in 2050, it's more than just halving the consumption. We can go into the details later, but it's quite substantial. The important thing is because for Greenpeace, we have also sets of ecological farming principles. One of the slides will show you this report. You can check it as well. And one of them, for us, there's a role for animal farming if we want to talk about fertilizing on the farm and in that respect. So there's also part of the reduction, or the other side of the reduction, is that whatever meat could be consumed has to be what we call better meat. And I've heard already some of the possible of that. So I'll stop there onto that. We can go back when there's different questions. We can do this during the panel. What I've heard, I think, and this is if you want, my 8 aspects or 8 comments on this, what I've heard so far, is that I think it's very important to avoid single bullet solutions. I think we have to think of systemic solutions. I think that's really the key elements there. Secondly, I think this issue of information deficit. We think, if we had, and we are also guilty at Greenpeace, and don't get it wrong, we think that if we have the best science, things will change. People will get aware of it, policymakers, and things will act. Well, it doesn't, unfortunately. We can regret it, but it's the situation. So we have also to understand who are the powerful economic interests beyond those situations. So let's not think that, and I know I'm aware of it, but more data will necessarily lead to action. I mean, that's the first thing. Thirdly, keep it simple. Let's not reinvent the wheel. I know, I think there's a lot of focus on technological fixed solutions, but I think we should also be aware that there are social innovations as well. Right? So let's also focus on this, because it's easier maybe to raise capital for technological innovations rather than actual social innovation, for example, which are probably a key element. Fourthly, yes, there's the climate change crisis, but there's also another crisis, which is a serious shrinking of a democratic space, not only south of the border. I work globally, I can tell you, in Philippines, India, maybe soon, unfortunately, in Brazil, Turkey, and the list goes on and on. Right? So we have to be also aware of that aspect, because it has a huge impact on the kind of solutions and to whom we're talking to whom we want to change there. So I think we have to be really aware of that. I've heard also lots of emphasis on we have to tell individual consumers to act. Well, yes, but there's only 24 hours a day. We can't be constantly become PhD and experts on every field. So we're putting a lot of burden on the individual consumers. But people are not only consumers. People are parents, citizens, So we have also to change the way we frame this. It doesn't mean we don't have an individual responsibility, moral responsibility, ethical responsibility to act. But we have to make sure that we also don't forget that dimension of this. Where am I? Time-wise? Fine. Okay, that's fine. So what's happening? I think, so now I've put the gloomy part. The more, let's say, what do we do? That's the search. What do we do? First of all, although we can be very depressing in terms of the situations, talk about the big words, aimism, capitalism, destruction of the environment, we can be very, very gloomy. But at the same time, we should not overrate that side either. And I give you a good example, and I think it was said in this conference yesterday. Let's not forget that 70% of the food eaten in the world is actually produced by small, less than 2 hectares farmers. I mean, it's a miracle that after 60 years of industrial agriculture and chemical agriculture, and largely driven by commodities, there is still some like 1 billion small farmers managing to feed the world. They are threatened by climate change, by lots of issues, but it shows resilience. Right? And when I look at so that's the first thing. We should not overstate what's facing us as well. And also recognize that there's lots of things happening. The food movement, when you think of it, is actually a combination of small farmers in the south. It's the rise of the foodies. I mean, there's an interest around foods and air. There's the issue of urban agriculture. There's food justice. There's a huge cluster, and I think this conference, in a sense, has tried to bring some of those main actors there. So I think we have to also see the strength in social change that could be built from this food movement. And we have to make sure, and that's probably a contribution of this conference as well, and others, to make sure it's fair and make the linkages between those different actors. 3 minutes, okay. So for Greenpeace, and I'm going to show you a little video. It's just at the end of a session, it's probably the good thing. Just me context first. It's what we decided to do on this meat issue and on food generally as a starter, it's not the end of it, is actually to address cities. As you know, the world population is more and more living in cities. It's also a subnational level of government that has not been totally corporate captured yet. So there is a space for it. It's level of government closer to people, where you can still mobilize people and to have a direct impact. Right? So we decided to focus on cities, and there's a movement out there, C40 on climate change, you got the Milano Pact on food issues, eClear, which is more on sustainability. So I think there's a room, and we think there's a room for actually getting more active on cities and mobilizing people there. And then the younger people as well. I think because of the urgency of climate change, because of what's happening politically, I think there's a new generation that is happening. So I'll stop there. There's a short video, it's cute, I was going to say it's cute, a little video which explain, and you probably see some of the elements of what I've said in that video. So let's go.
This is orchid! Industrial meat is making the people on the planet sick. It's destroying our forests, polluting our water, causing climate change, and being mean to animals. We need to do something quick. I'm just the team to sort this mess. Team plant. The grown-ups aren't stepping up. The world needs you now. We need to fix it. Got it. We need to investigate. It's not looking good. We need to be brave. We need to be skilled. We need to be confident. And we need to get the word out. We're calling for a change around the world. We need to eat less meat. And that's where you come in. We can't do this alone. Can you help us?
Okay. So thank you very much to all of our panelists, and thanks for the cute video at the end there. I think what we'll do is we'll start off by allowing the panelists, if they have any reflections that they'd like to state before we move to the audience. If there's anything that kind of came up during some of the other presentations that you'd like to touch on, feel free.
Well,
It looks like, Kathleen, you have something to
Well,
say.
Yeah, I'm happy to add, because I love the ideas that are percolating here, and I have to share with my colleagues that I've been changed in the thinking, that I've enjoyed really very much this diverse perspective. So I think the work that people are doing and using animals more responsibly is necessary. And certainly the drawdown gives all of those suggestions that you had, they're all in the top 80 actions that are already happening. So we need to do these things more logically and strategically, and certainly far less. Certainly reducing meat, some would go so far as be wild as I do and be plant strong, but I think we have a lot of strategies together.
Okay. Did any of the other panelists want to just have any reflections before we turn out to the audience?
Yes, well, I just want to point out that, yes, I think we all agree about the fact that we need less industrial meat. You know, the way that the vast majority of the meat around the world is raised is highly detrimental to the environment. So I think we all agree on that. And then I think we can use, yes, you know, cattle strategically and other types of animals as well in systems to actually regenerate our land. I'm not really well versed in terms of, you know, the global numbers of, you know, how much land we would have to, you know, how does that translate into our actual meat consumption? Are we eating too much of it at this stage? I've heard a lot about the fact that we are eating too much about it, yet in other discussions yesterday from Diana Rogers, namely, we heard that we're not actually eating that much meat, we're producing a lot of it, but the end result, what we're eating, is not necessarily that much per capita. So yeah, I'm not necessarily an expert on that, but I do know that, yeah, there's a huge opportunity to yes, regenerate degraded land and switch current production to do better.
Okay, Jeremy or Eric, anything? No? Okay, so no shortage of comments and questions. Maybe what we'll do is take 2 questions at a time, and if you want to direct your question to a specific panelist or to the panel at large, maybe you can indicate that. And do us a favor and tell us who you are before you ask your question. So we'll start with Carl and then back there.
Thank you. Carl Tiedemann, Soil for Climate. I have a question for Éric. You mentioned that Greenpeace is interested in cutting in half the livestock population, and I'm wondering, what is Greenpeace's, now that we've heard how important grazing is for healing land, getting carbon out of the air and so forth, how does Greenpeace propose to pull down or draw down the 300 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere in a time frame consistent with the preservation of civilization without regenerative grazing?
Okay, thank you. And Shannon, there's a question at the back.
Hello, my name is Şebnem Susam Sarayeva, totally an outsider. So my questions will be like lay people's questions. But yesterday, Jody raised the IPCC report that we have 12 years. A couple of days after that report, we had another report, at least in the UK. I don't know whether it was heard in Canada, but I'm just wondering whether we are not using the actual numbers we should be using. That report said we need to be reducing our meat consumption by 90%. Not 50%. And I'm suspecting that we are using the 50% not to scare off the people. So this is just a comment. The later report says 90%. But I just have a very quick question to the second speaker. I'm a lay gardener, and I'm told, no dig, add your compost, everything that you said to regenerate the earth. But I'm also told that I shouldn't be walking on the soil at all if I want it to be regenerating. And I'm hoping that I'm lighter than a cattle, let alone a whole herd. So how does it go together, the ideas that you can just let loose a herd of cattle and still be able to regenerate the soil? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll turn to the panel now and see if we have some answers. So starting with Éric.
Yeah, some of it, okay. The first question on the 50% reduction, right? I think it was just to first of all, it was to acknowledge that getting out of fossil energy only would not be sufficient to address climate change, right? So it was to address the issue of meat consumptions. I mean, if we don't do anything on the current scenarios, right, by 2050, agriculture will represent more than half of the CO2 emissions. Right? And about 64% of all that is animal, basically is livestock or meat consumption. So we have to deal with that. The reason of the 50%, right, it's important to understand that we have to be, and we are a global organization, you know, we have to be aware that there are lots of pastoralists in the world, you know, who live that. So we are not saying out to people to become vegan or vegetarians, although we should thank vegetarian and vegans to do their contribution there, right? I think we have to be aware. And then in the ecological farming principle, one of them is about fertilizers, right? So if we want to get out of oil-based fertilizers, we have to also think of the role of animals on farms, on fertilizing, but also on other aspects of agriculture and kind of ecological farming. I think that was that. Yeah, I think on the issue of carbon, yeah, I think it's we have to address it, but we have to be aware as well that, you know, as was said, we should be aware of not putting too much on single solutions, right? I know carbon sequestration is one of them has been advanced. What we know, and we can maybe have conversations beyond this meeting, is also to understand that carbon in soil is not necessarily stable all the time, right? So I think we have to be also aware of it. There are so many factors, basically, in this, right? And then there's the politics of it. We know in international negotiations, there's lots of pressure also to put a price to carbon in soil, right? So there's lots of mechanisms there. And we have to be very cautious. And I think lots of countries and lots of not going down that route. Because if you start putting carbon price in soil, you can just imagine which big company will be very keen to offer solutions to farmers. Some farmers, not the small farmers in the south who do it. So I think there's also a political dimension of this. But regardless of this technical point, I just want to really say that ecological farming, organic farming, regeneration agriculture, all work together to a more holistic approach to it. And if we manage to put carbon in the soil, fantastic as well. But let's also look at the broader issue as well. So that will be my support. But we can carry on, of course, later on.
To answer my question specifically, how does Greenpeace propose that we remove 300 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere? Thank you.
Well, I think it's, I can't go into the figures right now. I can give it to you. I'm work on food issues, not on climate issues per se, but I can give you and put you in contact with some of our experts on this. I will stop there.
Gabrielle?
Yes. So to answer your question about walking on your garden and how does it make sense for cattle to roam on land, I would guess it's really a context matter. So, say your garden, it's a market garden, it's annual plants. So, it wouldn't be recommended to have cattle walk on your market garden either. But on grassland, was that not your question? Sorry, what? I can't hear you.
It's also perennials.
Okay, so what are you growing specifically? Right, but on a grassland, it's perennial grasses that have been, we can walk on grasslands and it's not really a problem. And even if you have a herd of cattle that are there for a very limited period of time, it causes a short, intense disturbance. But then the whole concept of holistic management is to leave enough recovery time so the cattle don't come back to this plot until, sometimes months later, depending on the conditions. And that's how it was done in nature previously, and that's a way to regenerate soil very effectively. So, they graze the grasses. There's sometimes a little bit of root die-off, but then the plant is prompted to grow back very quickly, and it has a lot of recovery time. The trampling also stimulates, stimulates the composting process by putting some of the grasses back into the ground, favoring some mixing. There's some mixing with the manure as well. So it's different than it might be in your garden, whether you grow perennials or not. That's my understanding of it, at least.
Jeremy, did you want to add on that? I think that...
Yeah, I would just say that I would support all that. It's the way that these systems evolved, there was kind of a large ruminants walking on them, and like you were saying, they can actually play a role in helping cycle some of these nutrients down to the soil as well, through kind of really targeted, high-intense disturbance, but then not for a long time, too. So, yeah, I would just echo what Gabrielle was saying.
Okay, we're going to go to the front two questions. Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, hi. So most of us who are proponents of animal agriculture are admitting that industrial scale animal agriculture is not the solution and more regenerative, but I'm not hearing a lot about industrial scale plant production and how damaging that is. And one of the worst things for climate and for carbon emissions is actually tilling, much, much worse than the numbers that are attributed to animal agriculture. And I had a couple of points about some of the methodologies used for the land and the water numbers. So the land numbers, it's really hard to see land for cattle versus land for lentils when we know that more cattle are grazing on land that can't be cropped, that most of our agricultural land cannot be cropped. And so to compare lentils on land that can be cropped when we couldn't be cropping the land that cattle can be grazing on, it's unfair. Similarly, with the water numbers, the exaggerated water numbers that I saw up there are based on green water, not blue water. So green water, as I'm sure you know, is rainfall that would have fallen on pasture whether or not the cattle were there, whether or not the cattle ate that blade of grass that the water fell on. Rice emits more methane than cattle, and I'm not seeing anyone arguing for rice-free Fridays. The livestock long shadow numbers of 18% have been retracted. The EPA's more recent numbers are 2% from livestock. And there have been models looking at what would happen if we eliminated all livestock production from our food system. Nutrient deficiencies include B12, calcium, iron, zinc, long-chain fatty acids like EPA and DHA, and vitamins A and D. There are very serious health consequences of B12 deficiency, including permanent brain damage. There have been deaths in babies from this, and there are countries looking at making it illegal to feed babies a vegan diet. And there are a lot of genetic reasons why some people might do better on a plant-based diet, but almost half of the population cannot convert beta-carotene to vitamin A, so you've got right there, almost half the population would be deficient. So there's a lot of health consequences from only a plant-based diet. Humans are omnivores. And I think that we need to be looking at plant-based agriculture as critically as everyone's looking at animal-based agriculture.
Okay, thanks, Diana. I think Donald, you had your hand up before, and then the next round we'll go to Kate.
Thanks.
Scott.
I also wanted to add some complications to sort of all sides of the debate, plant versus animal agriculture and different sorts of animal agriculture. And I wanted to ask, or just complicate the scenario or the situation or the considerations with regard to the water footprint first. It's an unfortunate fact for proponents of extensive animal agriculture that the water footprint of extensively raised ruminants is even higher than the water footprint of industrial confinement ruminants. The reason for that is that the feed conversion of confined ruminants is so much higher, especially when there are pharmaceutical inputs, and so the feed conversion is so much greater in comparison to grazing. However, adding to what Diana talked about, my understanding, and I've traced back through the references that philosophers cite about water footprints, is exactly what Diana was saying, that it's mostly green water that makes up the water footprint that's commonly cited. And that is the amount of water that is evaporated from the soil and transpired from the crops that are grown for the animals, or the forage that is grown for the animals to graze. If you compare the water footprint of the crops or the forage that's grazed to a more natural habitat, whether it's a grass habitat or whether it's a forest habitat, they're comparable. So the net loss of water from grazing ruminants is about zero in comparison to a more natural habitat. Second, with regard to the greenhouse gas emissions, to complicate this dialogue as well, most of the greenhouse gas emissions figures, as I understand them, come from an assumption of the current mix of agricultural practices and assumes a conventional agricultural model mostly, and of course, therefore, ignores the salutary effect of the sort of regenerative processes that we've been talking about to sequester carbon in the soil. And again, I want to, in connection with greenhouse gas emissions, question our focus on food. If you consider the greenhouse gas emissions associated with one round-trip flight in 1 year from Chicago to London, compare that to lamb is sort of the worst methane emitter that there is. Compare the greenhouse gas emissions from a round-trip flight once per year that I mentioned in comparison to eating 2 extra quarter-pound lamb burgers per year. It's about the same. So that seems to be, if the greenhouse gas emissions associated with 2 extra lamb burgers per day on top of one's normal diet is a good reason not to do that, we really ought to question our common practices, especially for academics, totally within the realm of normal to take, to travel in that way.
Okay. And maybe I'll turn over to the panelists. I was going to build on that, but I'll hold off for now. Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen. Oh, we'll start with Kathleen. So go to you.
You're raising some really good points, and I think we have the opportunity to look at data that we might not want to, and that is Project Drawdown. These are the most recent findings, and I challenge a lot of what you're suggesting is insufficient because we want a particular outcome. We're not inclined to really hear all of what we need to hear. So Project Drawdown is one of the best tools we have. No one has come up with a solution yet. That's why Paul Hawken can say this is the most comprehensive strategy ever, because we don't have one. We have a lot of problems, but we don't have solutions. So in that 80 examples that are already proven, they've done very cautious and conservative calculations of outcomes. So you're quite right that there's opportunities to be thinking about this differently and looking at non-industrial scale. But we don't have that yet widely distributed. We have 70% of our world producing, or 70% of our small holders, thankfully, feeding us lovingly, and we can do more of that. So we have opportunity to really change the economic model. We have to look at neoliberalism. We have to look at world stability. These are not simple issues about food, and I think you're quite right, Donald. It shouldn't just be about food. It should be big picture thinking. Project Drawdown will show to you, as Gabrielle was saying too, all of those styles that you're suggesting. Regenerative, absolutely. Agroforestry, yes. All of those strategies are in there. They're just not giving you the bang for the buck on the top 10. They're going to give you other benefits for sure, but they're not in the top 10 for reversing greenhouse gases. That's really what we're after. We're not just mitigating, we're after improving conditions. So I'll just leave it there, but there's, and this is, yeah, I really challenge you to go and look at the best writers, the researchers who are current in this, examining that.
Éric, do you want to?
Yeah, I think I just want to echo, I think, on the issue of the impact, of course, of plant-based, right? But everything has an ecological impact, right? I think you're correct. So it's not an issue of getting rid of meat or reducing meat consumption by 50% only. It's also to change the system around it, right? So it's why in my very quick presentation, it was the 7 principles of ecological farming. Right? I didn't go into the details, but some of it is like food sovereignty, diversity on the farm, diversity in the landscape, rural development as well. Right? So I think we have to look at from that perspective as well. Right? I think it's important to approach it from a systemic perspective. And on the issue of, we need meat for diets or for nutrition aspect, I think the big issue as well is a bigger issue, which is inequalities in the world, right? So it's all about food justice. So I agree, some people might, and again, we can argue, because I think there are substitutions, we could conceive that some people might need more meat because of nutritious needs, maybe, right? And I'm holding it that one because I think we can go on debating. But the issue is why those people don't have access to that, right? So it's about food, access to food, right? So it's the issue of food justice has also to be put on the table. And then on the issue of impact of food and meat on the climate change, I think the figures are very wide because it depends how you calculate them, all right? I think the lowest one is 14% direct emission, but if you include land use changes like deforestation and so forth, which is necessary to feed animals, you go to 30, 32, and if you include the food system, it could go higher. So I think it's a pretty big chunk that we need to address if we're going to have a chance to address climate change and biodiversity and feeding people. So I think there's wide consensus. I don't think there is no consensus on this. I think that's, yeah.
Do you want to add in?
Well, just in relation to Kathleen's comment, when you said that in the top 10 there was no regenerative agriculture solution. There actually is. So number 9 is silvopasture in Project Drawdown. Silvopasture is basically mixing grazing of livestock with agroforestry in between trees, basically. So they have very high carbon sequestration rates that are listed in Carbon Drawdown. In Project Drawdown. I do want to mention here that Project Drawdown includes managed grazing. That's the way they call it. And again, I am no expert on the issue. I haven't looked deeply into their data, but I think there might be, again, as I mentioned in my presentation, there is science that's specifically looking at the holistic planned grazing methodology that's yielded really amazing results in soil carbon sequestration. I'm suspecting that because Project Drawdown is not calling it holistic management or holistic planned grazing, they're looking at a broader range of grazing methods. Managed grazing is still listed in there. The numbers aren't ridiculously amazing, but it is listed as a great solution too.
I'm going to use my I know there's a lot of comments, but I am going to use my my moderator's privilege to touch quickly on figures and messaging, because that seems to be an issue here. And I think the reason why I want to mention this is as we can tell from people who are involved in some capacity with forms of animal agriculture, that there's a real frustration, especially amongst regenerative farmers who I have some experience and connection with people. As I mentioned, my wife is one of them, and I recognize that, you know, like there was a slide that's commonly you had, Éric, that purports that emissions from the transport sector are essentially equivalent to the livestock sector. And the problem that I think what that does is that that message drives a lot of regenerative farmers a little crazy, because it's an unfair comparison. And I understand why organizations like Greenpeace have that very simple, clear messaging, because it's much easier for the public to digest a message like that. But it's unfair, and it's unfair for the following reason. Basically, that figure of 14.5% is an FAO calculated figure that looks at the entire sector of the livestock supply chain. A significant chunk of it is deforestation, which I think we can all agree is a terrible thing. Nobody should be cutting down trees in this world. But the transport figures are essentially just tailpipe emissions. And so if you're going to list 14.5%, which is the sort of scientific gold standard FAO-based figures, you're talking about an entire supply chain, including even post-production and transport of ironically, transport. And so you would then need to compare the entire supply chain of the transport sector. So you have to look at things like the production, building of airports and runways and highways and so on and so forth. So it's an unfair comparison, and it drives the people who are using livestock in a regenerative capacity kind of nuts. So I just wanted to sort of express that, and you could tell there's a bit of frustration for people who are trying to do that. So I wanted to put that out there. Kate, and then Scott.
Yeah, we have 5, so I'll get around.
And then I feel free to address my comment. Kate.
So I have one piece of information to add to the grazing, walking on the soil part. Actually, the coevolution is so cool when you look at cloven-hooved animals such as cattle and small ruminants. And when you juxtaposition them against, as example, the release of feral horses into the foothills, horses destroy ecosystems. The way in which they consume grasses is they shear and pull. And if you look at their teeth, you can tell this. Cattle, in contrast, they wrap their tongues around to pull, and they do less damage to the existing native grasses. So that's the one thing. The way in which they consume it is better, and then the cloven hooves create less damage than hooves or feet. So when we look at those animals in particular. there's my little ad. My question is completely different. We talk about reducing meat, and you're talking to all of us, and I've already heard repeatedly that Canadians are decreasing their meat consumption, and we're low. And then I look at the stats that I see regarding who is increasing meat consumption, and it's developing countries who have been predominantly on plant-based diets and now are becoming more affluent and want meat. Is it me, or are we the wrong people to be talking about reduction of meat? And what we should really be doing is talking to developed countries about using that wealth more wisely, because the only reason that we keep producing meat for export, which is another kind of layer in this question, because it's about our GDP, so totally, I think our economist isn't here, but we're producing meat for the growing, developing demand for meat, not for us. How are we changing this narrative? We're going to make a little, you shrink Canadians' consumption, tiny, tiny, tiny dent.
Okay.
You shrink developing, big dent. Help me rationalize that.
Okay. Scott?
Two things. So first, to riff a bit more on the need to nuance or maybe be cautious about small is beautiful romanticism and the figure of 80% of global food production being produced by smallholders. I don't pretend to be an expert in this area, but I do know that a new publication came out in Global Food Security this year, which purports to be the most comprehensive of its kind, and revised that figure significantly downwards to about 35%. So I think, I'm not saying that's the last word, but maybe we need to rethink that figure. The second is for anybody interested in the soil carbon sequestration in rangelands, so the panel and anyone in the audience. So, I mean, I support ruminants in extensive grazing systems and things like that for the agroecological and biodiversity reasons. On the climate bit, though, I mean, it's a saturation curve for carbon sequestration, right? So there's going to be a point where it tapers off. And depending on the stocking rate and the level of methane emissions, it could eventually become a net carbon source. I've heard that concern raised in the literature. I've never seen a satisfactory answer to it, but I don't pretend to have looked into it systematically, so I'd love to hear anybody else's thoughts on that. And like I said, it depends on a lot of things, the feed, stocking rates, etc. Thanks.
Okay. Éric?
Yeah, I think the issue of the climate change and the accounting mechanisms, right? Because I think it's also how you present figures of the CO2 emissions, right? Yeah. And I think for historical reasons, the international community looked more at the source, right? So it's about fossil energy and so forth. So it depends. It's why there's a controversy. Not a controversy. It's because it depends on how you look at the data. So you don't want to do double accounting. You know, that's because that's some of the issues you raised there. But the 14% figure, it's also it's a way to also send a message that we should not ignore the issue around meat consumption and food, right? Because it's something which we have to also tell that message as well. Right? Because so far, I mean, things are changing fast. The last 3-4 years, I think there's a momentum now. But I think it's also a way to illustrate what it is. So I think that's going to be that. I don't think it's. I mean, we'll have to talk a bit more about why farmers might think. I mean, I can see why, because it's it's the core business. Right? And if you do meat, and you feel really under attack there.
Well, because it's a comparison to the transport system, which is entirely based on fossil fuels, and methane, carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels, and even methane, fossil methane, is very different than biogenic methane, which is produced by livestock. And so that nuance can't possibly be translated in a simple message. And again, I understand why there's a motivation to produce a simple message, because it's easier for people to digest, no pun intended. But it's problematic because it lacks that context, it lacks that nuance. And one of the foremost climate scientists, Michael Mann, who says, he doesn't eat meat for personal reasons, but he says, really, the climate from a climate point of view, it's fossil fuels. We need to tackle fossil fuels, and so. Anyway.
No, I totally agree. I'm from Greenpeace, and I mean, most of our campaign efforts is on getting out of oil. So I'm totally with you on this. But because of the urgency, and there was a question on the urgency of dealing with climate change, it's also about tackling the others. And I think it's why we have to start thinking. I know we try to reduce things and say, okay, let's go to the first challenge, because we can't overwhelm people, it's too depressing and all this, right? But I think, especially on the issue of meat reduction, it's something which is, at the same time, very easy. I mean, it's not something we don't have to reinvent the energy system, right? It's something we can do quickly, right? I mean, quickly. Theoretically, I'm not saying it's easy in the psychology and of the way people actually behave, but it is quite easy, even if it seems now maybe something really difficult to do for cultural reasons, largely, right? So that's the first question, first answer. Maybe I'm not answering all the questions. North-south. Yes, north-south. I think, yes, even if consumption of meat has gone down in the north, I mean, look at the figures. Yes, it's gone down, but I mean, help me, some people have figures here. I mean, is it 90 kilos of meat in Canada? A bit more in the US? Still, even if it's going down. What is it? Anyway, I mean, okay,
Susan
let's not go to the figures, but let's see it's prior. I'm aware of a Chinese figure, which is going up, and it's probably about 40 or 45 or whatever it is, right? So we have to be aware of that, right? So the challenge is indeed in the expanding market in the south. But let's think it's the same thing but with climate change. I mean, if you look at from the south perspective, it's a very, okay, the north has been eating meat. It's a symbol of wealth. And now you're telling us we can't eat meat. Right? It's why the justice aspect of it has to be really, really talked about. And then if you want the moral or the ethical aspect from our perspective, if we, in the rich country where we still eat large quantity of meat, we don't show the example, what chance do we have? What chance do we have? I mean, that's the crunch of this. And just to put another twist, because I didn't answer the full questions on why 50%, and I would just want to go back to this. I just want to give you, because I deal with India, and just to show other things. As you know, there's Hindu nationalist government in place, who's, on paper, so good, they're against eating meat, right? Of course, we know it's totally, false because they quite export a lot of meat in the Middle East, right? So I think it's also that double edge. But the issue of meat eating in India, for example, is now being instrumentalized by Hindu nationalist government to do Muslim bashing, right? So we have really to be aware of that dynamics as well and not looking at it only from the north perspective, because it's a quite dangerous situation currently there. So the situation is now young people in urban settings who wants to show, let's say, disagreement with the current government, is actually saying, oh, I want to eat meat. It's kind of an act of resistance. It's how it's twisted, right? So I'm only giving this illustration to show the complexity in the cultural, political context in different contexts. Right? Anyway, I'll stop there, but I think it's to give a bit more.
And because we only have about less than 20 minutes left, I'm going to ask the panelists and questions to be short and specific.
I'm going to answer the more simple question of the carbon sequestration rates, the issue about saturation, and your question about would it become a net methane or carbon source. So one thing that's important to keep in mind when we think about carbon sequestration is the depth. And that's a really complicated question because for a very long time, we've looked at shallower depths, but we know that in grasslands, the roots go very, very deep. And so, supposedly it could potentially keep sequestering carbon at a meter deep or even more. And so we haven't looked at all those intricacies of how deep the carbon sequestration happens. So potentially, at shallower depths, it does plateau after a while, but many scientists have supposed that, at lower depths, it keeps building topsoil and building soil carbon. And actually, I'm saying that they have supposed, but maybe the science is further than I think. I'm not an expert on this. I know what the questions are and both sides of the arguments, but I'm not sure where the science is at this point. I'm glad you raised the methane question, because I wanted to add something about what I said in my presentation. What I presented about Christine Jones and her raising the bacteria that degrade methane in the soil, and because, by the way, methane in cows, it's their burps. It's not, so when they're grazing, it's actually going directed in the soil. I don't think there's a scientific consensus at this point about methane all being degraded through this process, or I'm not even sure about the proportion. So yes, potentially there's still a proportion that's not degraded and that's being emitted. But I want to raise that there was a recent study by Paige Stanley in 2018 that looked into, even with the methane emissions, even if we consider all the methane emissions from these cows, the carbon sequestration rates that they yielded from their study from doing holistic plant grazing way more than offset, those methane emissions. So it was still a net positive impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions.
I would just say I think we need to think more about time horizons, right, when we make those comparisons. Even with the deeper soil depths, that's music to my ears, but is that changing it, or is it just buying more time? I don't know the answer.
Okay. Sorry.
quick touch on that.
Okay, just simply through pure logic, like when you look at grasses, they're not going to keep building biomass forever and keep, but they're still performing photosynthesis on a daily basis, right? So those carbon compounds that they're producing, they are channeling it in the soil to feed the soil microbiome. So that carbon is going somewhere. They're not stopping to do photosynthesis, and they're not growing to be, tropical trees. So my logic tells me that it keeps sequestering carbon, but I'm not sure.
Kathleen or Jeremy, anything to add?
I would just add maybe quickly to that. I would just echo it. It's there's a lot of uncertainties around different elements of it, but it does still seem to be a good idea, On the timing thing, one thing that's when you think about a place like the prairies where the climate's really variable, on those photosynthesis rates, year to year, or even like month to month, it can be really different. So just that timing issue is one thing that I think we do need to think about a little bit more. But again, there's no consensus on how it works.
Yeah.
It's a tricky thing, right? And it's as we start doing these things and monitoring how they progress, I think we'll learn a lot about them. But that's probably the next step.
I'll leave time for.
Okay. We have an order of 5 right now, so we'll see if we can get them through. So we'll go here, the back, then Jody, and then Seth had his hand up, and then we'll see if you're good. Okay, so we'll see how much we can cover.
Hi, I'm Gabrielle Diaz. One of the most fun things about working with food is that it's so complex, right? And Kathleen mentioned a system approach to things. And what I'm finding is probably we all have a bit of the truth or science, but we're not putting it all together. And the problem, is like we probably need a few hours now to see, okay, this, is there any contradiction? But I think there's probably more agreement than disagreement around regenerative agriculture and animal systems. But we also have to, there's a couple of things we need to clarify. We keep talking about meat as if it's protein. And protein, like I said, there's twice the protein, not twice the meat that we need. And I said that in Canada, we consume twice the protein because it also comes from milk and other sources. Yeah, it comes from all kinds of sources when we talk about the amount of protein. And not all of it's, of course, the same digestibility. And we also keep thinking about this or that. And it's reduction and sequestration, right? 75% of greenhouse gases are coming from fossil fuels. And but the question of livestock and meat is it's not just about climate change. There are other aspects of animal agriculture that are negative if done wrong. And I said yesterday, the reason we can't support current livestock numbers and meat consumption is because of the way we're doing it. We're not doing it well, but we're also not doing plant agriculture well. So we need regenerative plant agriculture. It's not going to have to be monocropping. We have to change the whole system. We said we need regenerative agriculture. I think we all agree with that, right? So the other thing, and I don't want to talk too much, I said there are 1 billion cattle in the world. They're not all meat animals. So that 15% of greenhouse gases is not just coming from meat. It's milk. And half of that number of cattle is in India, Brazil, and China. So it's really more complex and nuanced than we're talking about. So I just wanted to sort of say, we probably have more agreement than disagreement. And I do have a question at the end of this all. What is the potential of mixed cropping and other things? Like, we haven't touched on that for protein, because we're talking about we need mixed systems, we need livestock systems in certain situations. But I think if we went to a very clear, okay, if we're talking about grassland regeneration, there's only so many animals still. Like, we can't keep the same amount of beef with that, I don't think, for example. But so we do have to look for other sources of protein, and to do it right, if we don't want to be feeding grains to other animals like chickens and pigs and whatever else. So what is the potential of that? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Okay.
Sorry for the
No problem.
And Brent?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Goretti said what I wanted to say.
Okay.
I just wanted.
You can pass.
Yeah, I think that we're comparing apples and oranges. So the pro-plant people are saying eating a plant-based diet is better than industrial meat. And the meat people are saying eating regenerative meat is better than industrial plants. So my question was...
disagree with regenerative.
Yeah. So my question is, how can we change the dialogue from these polls to people should eat good meat, people should eat good vegetable protein, and I think because also people are usually more motivated by a positive message. You should do X rather than you should not do Y.
Right. Okay. Quick comments from the panel.
Can I speak to that? Can I speak to that one quickly, just about the crop mixing?
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing. Yeah, and I'm kind of torn, in terms of how you might approach it. Do you look at a landscape and then you think about having this mix of crop across the landscape, but you're still in one place, it's just one crop, but it's, that type of thing, versus when I mentioned when we started growing lentils, some people actually, you can intercrop it with wheat, and the combines we use can sieve them out differently and all that kind of stuff. So the technology's there, it's been there for a long time. I don't know, some people did that. I don't know why they stopped exactly, There's this one really prolific ag extension guy, Kevin Hirsch, who used to do that, and basically everybody listens to him for everything else except for that. So I don't know why, but
real quick,
yeah,
it's Kevany. We've got Lana Shaw out of Southeast Saskatchewan. She's only been able to get $80,000 over 5 years for her intercrop flax chickpea experiment, which reduces herbicide use. And basically the only chemical folks are using is the front end fertilizer. But the hegemony in agriculture is we do things this way. The box is so tight that you look at a yield drag of any kind. If I've got to modify my equipment, the assumption is that farmers aren't going to do it. We've trained them to be our little minions in this way, and they're not going to do it.
Okay. Kathleen?
These are all great comments and great questions, so I'm just going to touch on a few together, I think. And in terms of the percentage of the world that's producing in small operations, it's relative, isn't it? It's a percentage relative to the global market, and it's the penetration of the agro-industrial complex. And so we can see that we heard yesterday that they're going into places they weren't before, modifying earlier systems. So I think in reference to your point, Brent, that we certainly could be talking, and I think also, Kate, you're saying, who are we putting this message out for? It is a global message. It isn't just for this audience. We're not just talking about this moment in time. We're talking about we need strategies, and we need really creative ones, and we have to change some of what we're doing around certainly our personal investment in the industrial system. How many of us spend money at the farmer's market? Where are we getting our own food? And of course, if you're producing it yourself, all the better. And if you're doing it regeneratively, blessings. You know, those strategies are all essential. But collectively, we're not necessarily the random sample here. We are an informed population. We have got to get the message to others who are not practicing this. We're helping the Weston family. I love them too, but they don't need our money. Sobeys and Irving, all of them. You know, we have got to be wiser. As that's one panel that we're missing, is a political turn us into policy action.
Strategic.
So, because I think you're right. There's opportunities, and as Georgette's saying, we're in great agreement, but we've got to get past the sticky points. We've got to make some changes.
To answer your question, Brent, you were concerned we were comparing apples to oranges. I think we know enough by now. We've heard enough in this conference to hear that, meat is the best protein on per calorie ratio. And we heard also that having a diet that's higher in protein, reduced mortality rates, reduced, I think, cardiovascular diseases. I think that we should have a mixed diet that includes regenerative meat and regenerative vegetables. Now, the quantities and, there's a lot of cultural aspects in our diet, and I think some people will eat more meat, some people less. But I think, regardless of what the global situation might be, do we have enough land to do this or that? If we switch to regenerative grazing already, and there will be much less land used for growing grain for cattle, that's already going to be an improvement. And I think that we know enough now to start the switch and shift our diets, and we shouldn't wait to see how it translates on a global level, because we know already that this is way more positive than both for our diet and for environmental matters. So.
I think we may have time for one or two more comments from the audience.
Just two quick comments. Wow, that was loud. Thanks for that. I'm going to hold it here. Thanks for that session. It was really good. Two things that have come up are really important. So Donald's comments about academics are really important. To be fair to those of us who are not full professors, the reason why we do conferences is this is part of the metric for promotion. So full professors in this room, shut the hell up about it and do something in your departments about academic metrics, because you're responsible for this shit. So stop that. Second thing that Donald brought up yesterday was pronatalism. No kidding, that's toxic. And in bioethics, I do human biomedical ethics. No kidding, pronatalism is toxic. And so we do need to engage that. But justice came up in this session. I think it's really important to keep reiterating this. There are structural problems here about choices being made in the global south that they have no control over. And we need to recognize that Anne Cudd, who's a really important feminist philosopher, talks about the invisible foot. We need to actually recognize that certain rational choices are rational and they're not in people's best interests, and that invisible foot keeps them down. And we need to recognize that, and we need to stop being so disingenuous about this. We don't get to actually ask the global south not to do what we did to build our economies. And one of the things that's deeply disingenuous, and I really worry about it when it comes up in this room in discussion, is we talk about this as if we can actually talk to the global south about not doing what we did. What we did gave us what we have here. And it's people in this world that don't have it and want it and reasonably want the opportunities that we have. We need to have a more uncomfortable conversation about what we did to this planet to get where we were and how we can redistribute our wealth so they don't have to. Let's not talk about what they shouldn't be doing given what we did. Let's start talking about how we can redistribute what we earned by poor misconduct or bad misconduct in a way that provides them the opportunities to actually live as we take for granted and wouldn't want to give up. And stop talking about them making bad choices. There's structural problems here. There's justice problems here. Again, two rules. Don't be an asshole and leave the planet in better shape than we found it. Don't be an asshole about folks that want to have better opportunities and are stuck in a world that we helped create through misconduct. We need to talk about redistribution here as well when we're talking about choices.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more comment or question. Thanks. So you'll get the last one, but judging from the the interest, I think we'll probably have a lot of conversations in the hallway thereafter. And I just, while Paul's setting things up, I wanted to comment on something Kathleen mentioned. One of the intentions with this conference is to seek the next phase of the project is the outreach component. And in terms of the policy dimensions, we're going to try and get some funding to get some students to synthesize some of the discussion that's occurred over this day and a half, and maybe we'll use the IPCC's sort of method for each point, whether there's a consensus on a particular issue or lack of consensus on various issues. But that might be one way of addressing some of the tensions and points of disagreement that we have.
So thanks, and pressure on me for the last comment. And this is just actually going back to the previous comment and to Kate. And there certainly is the question is, there is obviously the challenges that are coming out of BIC, and where are we versus what is happening in the emerging nations. What I would urge is that I think that what is incumbent on us and our responsibility is that we have to help with the solution, because ultimately Canada has one of the most trusted, and in the future, as we face climate change, increasingly the world will look for us for one of the most trusted food supply chains. And I think there's that responsibility. And I think with it, we have the responsibility to assist the world in terms of solutions. And I come back to what I've been very intimately involved in sustainable seafood. And what is interesting around sustainable seafood is, in fact, that countries like China are actually looking to us as part of helping to come up with their own solutions. So if we can come up with an appropriate solution or show leadership, it will find its way elsewhere in the world. So that's my last comment. Thank you.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we are right on time to take a break. Feel free to accost our four panelists in the hallway, but let them have a chance to take a little break and get a snack. Thank you guys very much. Join me in thanking our panelists.